it's over.
Yeah,
We'll be in a full-fledged war.
expand on that a little bit because it's sort of interesting. You say like, hey, this started. Maybe Putin was going to do it anyway, but the reality this started, in my opinion, because NATO was talking about taking let's call it a 500-mile long buffer zone that has been historically a buffer zone since basically World War II, which was the Ukraine, and moving NATO's borders towards Russia. Now, maybe Putin was going to do it anyway. I'm not saying he's, a good guy or a nice guy. I'm not apologizing for him, but no one seems to talk about that the movement of and the talk about moving NATO onto Russia's border when you had this very large buffer zone of the Ukraine was sort of the excuse that they needed. I mean, it is as though we were goading him into this to begin with. What are your thoughts on all of that?
I think we grossly miscalculated. Putin had made several speeches over the last 20 years, repeatedly saying, please do not advance the border to Russia. Do not try to transform Ukraine into a hostile actor, an actor with hostile intentions towards Russia. What happens in Ukraine is of existential strategic interest to us, just as theoretically what happens in Mexico is of existential strategic interest to us, although this administration has decided to ignore it. That's going to come back to haunt us. And if you're looking for future conflict, that's where to look for it, not in Europe and not in Asia. But the point is that Putin wasn't pulling any wool over anyone's eyes, and Putin absolutely didn't want a war. If you go back and look at the force that he sends into Ukraine earlier in February of 2022, he goes in with about 90,000 troops. He limits his advances to the periphery because he expected that we would negotiate, that he would demonstrate that this was serious and that Russia wanted its population in eastern Ukraine, which is really Russian, to have equal rights before the law. He wanted to end the oppression of the Russians that lived there. And he wasn't going to surrender Crimea. The reason he went into Crimea is he was afraid it was going to be turned into a U.S. naval base by the Ukrainians at the earliest opportunity. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. Now, he went along and thought that he might get a negotiated settlement, and he finally figured out after several months, nobody's going to talk to me, especially after Biden said, our goal is regime change. Our goal is to get rid of Putin. And our goal is ultimately to divide Russia into constituent parts, then exploit it. All of his supporters, his staffers, everyone in the globalist camp knows this is the truth. The so-called oligarchs, Kolomoisky, Soros, and others are all part of this. None of this is news. Finally, he said, enough's enough. He stopped. They set up a strategic defense. They ran an economy of force mission. And now they have a force in place that can go as far as it needs to go, which includes to the Polish border. They have a plan for a 31-month war against us if we insist on fighting it. And we are in no shape to fight a war. We can't even recruit the United States Army or the Marines. The Marines are running around trying to recruit illegals and are being encouraged to do so by the administration. Is that what you want in the ground force to fight for this country? Forget it. It's not going to work.
So, I guess that's interesting. A lot of people probably aren't aware of that because I think when you look at it sort of on paper, you obviously have the media reports, right? Every time, Russia takes a big town, well, it's not really of strategic importance, but every time Ukraine claws back 7 inches in a major military victory. So, you see the gamesmanship happening in the media, but I'll say this as an outsider who doesn't know and perhaps, didn't know that, hey, maybe him coming in was to bring everyone to the table in a negotiating tactic. But, you think of it like me with sort of, again, that Cold War mentality of like, the Russian army will steamroll. It's like, well, how did they not take over this country in 2 weeks, let alone, a year and a half now? To me, and maybe to the uneducated on the subject, it feels like maybe one of the bigger sort of miscalculations or underperformances of recent military history. Is that not the case, or is that also a combination of it? Did he, misjudge some of it, or is that just because 130 billion in missiles given to a militia, can still hold back someone who's not going all out, or using tactical nukes, or whatever it may be, that next escalation where he could again take over the country rather quickly?
Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country that is rooted in Russian nationality, history, culture, language, and ethnicity. So forget the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a brother Slavic country. The last thing Putin wanted to do was destroy Ukraine. Putin would have been perfectly happy to have Crimea recognized, to gain those equal rights for Russians inside eastern Ukraine, and to declare the place neutral, because the neutral Ukraine would have provided exactly what you're discussing, not only a buffer for NATO and the West, a buffer for him, for Russia. He wasn't interested in any of the things that he's been accused of. That's what Professor Mearsheimer has said. Anyone who understands Russia, knows what's happened over there since 1992, gets it. All of that's over now. Your dad, President Trump, could have intervened in February or March and put an end to this quickly. And I'm confident that he would have. We would have convened talks without preconditions. We'd have come to some sort of new territorial arrangement. And I think we would have had a neutral Ukraine, which was in everyone's interest, and no war. But now those days are past. This government in Moscow, it's not just President Putin, his entire population is enraged. They don't trust anyone in the West, especially since Chancellor Merkel and now President Macron have both admitted that the so-called Minsk Accords, which were supposed to address these issues, were a facade. They were a fraud. They were designed to, quote unquote, buy time to build up Ukraine. And they built it up. That was not a militia that was defending eastern Ukraine. They were actually very good soldiers. Most are now dead. They've had 300 to 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, another 300 or 400,000 wounded. They're now forcibly dragging old men and boys into uniform to fight. They're desperate, which is why they'll take anything they can get. The Russians are not desperate. They don't have a recruiting problem. They've had 100,000 volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists or more that they've mobilized. Russia's population is squarely behind Putin. What have we got here in this country? We have a divided society, divided along every conceivable issue, from economics, class, race, you name it. And this society doesn't even support the military establishment that desperately needs talent and Americans inside uniform. And this is what this administration thinks it can commit to a war? I mean, this is sheer lunacy. We need to get out of this before we're dragged into something. And the notion that we could take on the Chinese, a nation of 1.4 billion people, what do you plan to do with your military power against that? What makes you think anything we would do would influence them? And as President Trump pointed out, that's an economic competition, one that he could handle. Unfortunately, we're not even in the competition anymore. We've surrendered.
Well, the Navy has a drag queen influencer that's going to help the recruitment problem right now, Colonel. So I'm sure things will be just fine. What could go wrong?
Right. That's true. Well,
maybe Xi will laugh himself to death because I have a feeling that's probably not going to have the intended effect, or maybe it will have the intended effect, and that's just where the military is right now. But maybe talk about your military background and how did it shape your views on foreign policy? Because I know as we talk about the wars, I think your views on war and perhaps America's involvement in war have also changed, right? From some of the early sort of Middle Eastern stuff, where you were at the beginning of that to where you are now has probably grossly changed. So how did that evolve?
Well, remember, I and most of the people of my generation, our formative experience was service in NATO in Europe. And when NATO went away, most of us stood around in 1992, 93, 94 and said, well, NATO has to go in one of two directions. Either it becomes Europeanized, in other words, the Europeans take responsibility for themselves, we can still be a partner, or we just leave because there's no mission for us in Europe anymore. By the way, I had plenty of experience with Russian organizations and units after the fall of the wall, and I can tell you they were absolutely not our enemies. In fact, they did great work for us, particularly before we went into Afghanistan. But if I go back to the 1970s and I look at the ruins in which the military was found at that point, and then look through the 1980s where we rebuilt and we improved our position dramatically, It took very little time after 1991 for that military to be dismantled and ultimately to be ruined. And we got more and more and more generals and more headquarters and fewer soldiers. We lost 163,000 experienced combat soldiers in 1991 and 1992. And we kept every general officer we had on active duty and added some. This is the problem. This rot has been underway for a long time. And we've lost the discipline, the cohesion, the esprit de corps. I would say Special Operations Forces was an area where there was a holdout. And of course, the administration hates special operations because they claim it's another hotbed of white supremacy. So they're now talking about trying to do away with as much of it as they can.
Everything is white supremacy or climate change, just so we're clear. I mean, at least in the minds of the left, any problem can either stem from white supremacy or climate change or both. So, yes.
So my argument is in 1991, we were a very healthy organization, but we were also disappointed, many of us, because we thought that we had gone over there to fight a war and win it. We discovered after a very short period of time, hostilities were ended. And then the big lie was perpetrated that, well, we really didn't set out to remove Saddam Hussein. That's not really why we went. We just wanted them out of Kuwait, which is not true because we then began trying at every opportunity to kill Saddam Hussein wherever he went. We bombed the place into the Stone Age. So the bottom line is we stood around and said, well, wait a minute, we could go to Baghdad with 5,000 men and pick up Saddam Hussein and that bunch and put another group of Iraqi generals in charge and let the UN handle it. The last thing we needed to do was occupy anything. And of course, when we went back in 2003, originally, that was the plan. We were not going to occupy. But again, the same people that pushed nation building in Somalia, nation building in the Balkans, suddenly we were going to build a nation in Iraq. And the insanity took off from there. If we had picked up Saddam Hussein and simply said, thanks very much, we're out of here, you and I and a lot of other people wouldn't even talk about the place today. But we stayed and tried to govern it with our military. What a catastrophe. The last thing you want to do is occupy anything. Now we're trying to fight a proxy war for all the wrong reasons, and we're killing the Ukrainian nation. They're down to perhaps 14 to 18 million now from an original population back in January of 2022 of about 34 million. Everyone's left that could go. They've either gone east, almost 2 million into Russia, or 10 million west into Europe. And when you talk to them on the way out, as most of the news media have, they say, will you go back? Never. Yeah. Ukraine is the historic breadbasket of Europe. It is enormously productive. It could be the gleaming jewel economically if we had neutralized it. It could be as wealthy and prosperous today as Austria is. And that was the model. That's what we should have done. Instead, we got this terrible war. And today, Russia is not weak. Russia's military is now larger and stronger than anything that we've seen since the 1980s. Its economy is booming. And as I said earlier, 81 nations are headed to St. Petersburg in June for a major conference, the purpose of which is to bring them into this larger plan to back currency with gold. And the gold in China, the gold in Russia, the gold in India is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. It's just the beginning. The question is, what do we do? And these people in Washington have no answers. Yeah. And that's why prices rise, services fall apart, the armed forces are in ruins, our borders are open, and there is no rule of law. We are being destroyed by this regime in Washington.
Are there moments in your service that stand out to you? What inspired you to join the Army in the first place? And did you see, in a sort of longer and storied career? I mean, you led the last tank battle. We got to get to that one too. But the last sort of great tank battle, because I think from a military history standpoint, that's sort of fascinating when you talk about the evolution of warfare and how that doesn't exist. But what did you see in those changes? What moments sort of stood out to you? Any sort of interesting stories where you're saying, wait a second, how this isn't what I got in for. This isn't what our military was like when I signed up initially.
Well, in 1958, when I was 5 years old, my mother took me to West Point. and that was it. I decided that's where I wanted to go, and that's what I wanted to be. And in the 1950s, as you can imagine, I grew up in a household where people like Douglas MacArthur, Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill were heroic figures that I was brought up to admire and respect. And that led me down this path of interest in the military. And it never changed, to be perfectly frank with you. The only other interest I ever had was classical music, and my grandmother was a concert pianist, so I enjoyed playing the piano, but it wasn't something I was going to do for the rest of my life. So that was the beginning. Then I went to Germany as an exchange student from 69 to 70. And I lived with a family whose father was a professional soldier, a German officer in the Second World War. And at the end of the war had been accepted to the general staff system. He was fluent in Russian, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He was a classical scholar, and he spent a lot of time with me and taught me a great deal about the military and warfare. My maternal grandfather had served in the First and Second World Wars. He was an Army officer in World War I, became an officer in the Navy in the Second War. My father hated the military, but my parents were divorced. But he served in the Second War. He commanded what you would call a Higgins boat. And he ended up, his last mission was in Okinawa, where he landed troops in Okinawa in 1945. So everybody had served in the military. I knew what it was about. I knew the good sides and the bad sides, and I chose it as a profession. And I didn't get in the first shot. I lost out to somebody recruited for football at West Point in Philadelphia. So I ended up going to the Virginia Military Institute for a year, which was a very good thing for me. And it did a lot for me, changed my attitude towards a lot of things. And it didn't turn me into a Confederate, but I certainly gained an appreciation for the South. And then I went on to West Point. And I would think after that, I was very fortunate. I served under a number of excellent officers and had great success with soldiers. I discovered pretty quickly that 90% of the soldiers are top-rate people, top-flight people. Our biggest problem are bad officers. We have too many officers, and a lot of them are mediocre. And one of the things that I learned from the German that I lived with for a year was one good officer is much better than 4 or 5 mediocrities. The soldiers deserve the best. And if you want them to perform to the best of their ability, you give them the best possible officer. And I've stuck by that for the rest of my life. And the other thing was that he and everybody else that I grew up with was very much convinced that you had to lead from the front. And so I went into a tank and I led the 1,100-man formation from a tank. We had 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. We were part of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regimental Battle Group of about 7,000 or 8,000, and we were the lead element in the 7th Corps. And to be frank with you, there was no plan for us to collide with and fight the enemy. In fact, they were trying very hard to position us in such a way that we did not make contact directly. They were going to try and destroy as much of the enemy with indirect fires as they could. The problem was we ended up in a sandstorm and we drove headlong into the enemy, but the soldiers were brilliantly trained, great captains, great non-commissioned officers. We went into the attack and within about 30 minutes destroyed most of what was the rear guard for the Republican Guard Corps, about 25 to 2,800 men, 30 or 40 tanks, 100 other armored fighting vehicles and artillery. And then we were told to stop. And we stopped at this thing called the 73 Easting. This is a north-south line in the desert because, of course, in the desert, you can't point to some town or a mountain. There's nothing there.
Not a lot of natural waypoints, right?
Right. So they said, where are you? And I remember we reported that we were at 736 or something. I've forgotten the rest of it. But we were a little bit beyond the 73 line. And they said, well, you got to fall back to the 70. I said, fall back? And I said, why? Why? And of course, I got into an argument. Finally, I said, no, we're not falling back. The regimental commander knew me, and the deputy regimental commander said, all right, let Macgregor stay there. So we stayed there. We ended up fighting for another 2.5 hours because once we broke through the Republican Guard's rear guard, we started having large numbers, hundreds of tanks and armored fighting vehicles, thousands of troops retreating north. Only since we were out in front by about 2 miles ahead of everybody else, they started slamming into us. And so we ended up doing a lot of damage until these people were either surrendering or disappeared. So it was an extremely successful battle. And like many successful actions, it was an accident. One that I'm very proud that I was part of, simply because of the enormous professionalism, bravery, and courage of these soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and warrants that were there with me on the ground. I mean, I cannot begin to tell you what spectacular soldiers they really were. If I could have, I'd have given every man in the unit a Silver Star. But of course, you can't do that.
That's amazing. A lot of history right there. It's sort of, I guess, the culmination of a lot of history. And I guess you haven't really heard much about tanks, since then, and except for, I guess, now that we're back to Ukraine, where there seems to be a resurgence, and they're sending American tanks, whether it's surplus or perhaps some of the stuff that's more obsolete, over there. But you're watching these things. A tank goes in and a missile takes it out from 5 miles away, and it seems like it's a very different game with the advent of a lot of technology. I don't know that I'd want to be in a tank right now. It seems it's a very secure place when someone's got a rifle, not so much when they have Hellfire missiles.
Well, actually, when you're walking around on the ground with a weapon, everything can kill you. You have no protection at all. So you're better off in an armored fighting vehicle in 90% of the cases. Mm-hmm. The problem is that if you go out there without effective air and missile defense, you're done.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to counter the enemy's air and missiles. We have lots of systems, but our army has neglected this for decades. Simply because since World War II and even during the Second World War, we didn't need much air defense. Remember that when we fought the Germans in Western Europe, their air force was largely stripped away or defending cities against bombing attacks. So we were usually dealing with, 1 or 2 airplanes, and we had 5,000 over us protecting us. Well, that's all changed now. But there are lots of systems that can annihilate these small drones. You can shoot down cruise missiles. What you cannot shoot down are hypersonic missiles. But hypersonic missiles are not meant for troops in the field. They're meant for headquarters, command and control, bunkers, ships at sea, large capital ships, aircraft carriers, this sort of thing. But we have to rethink how we organize. And it's a question of, do you need tanks? Of course you do. How many do you need versus other things? And what kind of air and missile defense do you have with you? The Ukrainians are in a lot of trouble right now because the Russians have spent months annihilating all of the air defenses that they have. Because the Russians learned from the Second World War, once the air defense is gone, you can operate as you wish and annihilate everything. And that's where the Russians are headed now. Ukrainians have almost no air defense left. And we, by the way, have almost nothing we can afford to ship them unless we're willing to operate without any air defense ourselves. We don't have the war stocks anymore. We've given it all up. All the artillery ammunition, missiles, and so forth. It'll take years to replenish the arsenals in the United States and elsewhere across Europe. Again, another reason why it makes a lot of sense not to go to war. We just don't have the ammunition, the missiles, the rockets. We don't even have the right structure and organization for it. So back to your first point, you got to get rid of those 44 4-stars. Then you need a new structure where you take it down to about 10 4-stars. And you simplify your structure. We've got too many headquarters with too many focuses and too many interests. And in the meantime, you take 30 or 40,000 U.S. combat troops and you put them on the Mexican border immediately and stop it.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned hypersonic missiles, and I couldn't help but remember around the time that we have the botched Afghan withdrawal, and Milley is saying he wants to learn about white rage. China was in the process of, literally, I guess, testing nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles. Talk about that, the threat of China, the growing concern about Taiwan, and what an invasion by China could look like. I mean, I think based on the incompetence that we're displaying on a national stage, there was probably always a timeline that China was going to do this, but it feels like whatever that timeline is, it has been greatly accelerated. What are the national security interests in Taiwan? What does that look like as far as military readiness is concerned, et cetera?
Well, remember that all of your intercontinental ballistic missiles that fly at a rate of 40,000 feet per second, they are all hypersonic. So we have hypersonic missiles. They're intercontinental ballistic missiles. The hypersonic missiles we're focused on at the moment are designed for shorter ranges on a regional basis to be largely conventional. Can they be nuclear? Of course. But the nuclear option is not the first option for the Russians and the Chinese. Both have made that very clear. China embraced a no first use doctrine decades ago. Now, as far as their arsenal is concerned, you're right. Over the last 10 years, it's been rather modest. They've only maintained what they thought they needed, which was, by our standards, maybe a few hundred warheads to protect themselves against a nuclear attack. They're now doubling that overnight. They're building far more missiles. But the Chinese have been far more afraid of us and afraid of our attacks than anything else. And there's no interest in China in conquering Taiwan. The timeline for reunification, according to Xi, who is the current emperor of China, we need to stop thinking about communism and now start thinking about the Chinese as an imperial state as it once was for thousands of years, because that's what it is. Xi has said 2044, 2045, 2046 was the target date. And the thing that we don't understand in this country is that Taiwan and China are very similar in the sense that both peoples in both places want the same thing. They all want to live in a society that looks a lot like Singapore. None of them are interested in liberal democracy. They're all interested in prosperity, making money, having the freedom to make money, having the freedom on a personal level to live as they have lived for hundreds and thousands of years. They're not interested in a society like ours. In fact, the Chinese look at our society and can't even begin to imagine how we live in it. Because if you think the kind of criminality we tolerate would be tolerated in those countries, you're very much mistaken. Give you a quick example. The Chinese military is really largely defensive in its orientation. There are no Chinese armies massing to prepare to march into Southeast Asia. In fact, they met with the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese and the Chinese have reassured each other there will be no war between them. And we have been trying to goad the Vietnamese into a relationship with us, thinking that somehow or another we can leverage them against the Chinese. You have a similar phenomenon on the Korean Peninsula. The South Koreans aren't interested in going to war with China. China is their biggest trading partner. And then there's Japan, very similar. The Japanese now have with China something they have not had ever in their history. They have what we would call a free trade arrangement. They have access to Chinese markets. One of the reasons the Japanese and the Chinese fought with each other is that the Chinese emperors always insisted that you pay tribute to China. It was kind of a tax that allowed you access to the market, but you had to pay tribute. Japanese don't pay tribute to anybody. And so the Japanese went to war. Well, that's over. The Japanese have factories in China. The Japanese can send their agricultural products to China. They may have disputes, but no one is going to go to war with them. No one in Asia is talking about a war except us.
So you wrote
and if you think you can fight a war with China with the United States Navy, you're insane. All those surface ships, if they come within 200 nautical miles of China, they'll be targeted and sunk. There's no future for that. And we don't need to do it. Everything has changed. Submarines, unmanned submersibles, space-based intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance platforms. Those are the things that dominate warfare. Large surface fleets are a thing of the past, which I think is part of the reason the Navy is so anxious to paint China as this great enemy on the scale of Imperial Japan. But we're not going to fight that way in the future. And China is not interested in a war with us.